Okay, hello everyone. I'm Mary Rosales with the Ateneo de Manila Institute of Philippine Culture, a university for which all our participants are connected directly or indirectly. We're very pleased today to present our 5-hour take on 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines, which we call Narratives and Counter-Narratives. As we know, there is a whole range of how you think about 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines. Let me just introduce how this came together, because then our three participants, and I hope Karl Gaspar is here, and I hope Fernando Zialcita is here.
I'm here.
I'm here.
Mary.
Let me tell you how this started. In 2018, Brother Karl Gaspar, who's also Dr. Karl Gaspar because he is an anthropologist with a PhD from UP in anthropology, was given the Parangal Lingkod Sambayanan by the Ateneo de Manila, the Public Service Award, very distinguished award given to people who are really very deserving of it. And when he gave his talk related to that award, it was a review of what happened to the indigenous people of the Philippines then, how so many of them became the dominant Christian majority, but a high proportion remained what is now called indigenous people. And those are the people he was reviewing all those years up to the present. And he ended his talk very dramatically, saying, after all that they have gone through, Magsosori ba tayo? And that jarred many of us who were in the audience and said, we should discuss that. We should think about that. And so some of us who were interested met later on and began to talk about this issue of to what extent is, maybe not Christianity, but the society in the process of becoming Christian as a dominant part, were responsible for what happened to those who didn't join that trend. And so we met several times, and it was a very fascinating discussion, multidisciplinary, historians, anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers, theologians, and they're all here today and tomorrow for the discussion groups, these roundtables. So we thought it would be, each one is pursuing his or her own research interest within the framework of narratives, counter-narratives, but we get together to share ideas and really get very stimulated. And in that process, we thought, let us join as a panel, as two sets of panels, roundtables at this conference today. And to my somewhat surprise, we are all here. And the modern technology is amazing, but the dedication of our participants is equally amazing. So let me just say that this is, in a sense, a takeoff of what each of them is going to be pursuing, we hope, for the next 2 years at least, during the 500 years celebration, it's called that by the Catholic Church. And we hope to put together the individual research pieces that really learn from one another, that benefit from the discussions we have as a group. And we hope that the participants who are listening in will actually join this, because we would like to have a very large group. It's very flexible, autonomous. And so we're looking forward that the idea of counter narratives in relation to narratives will become one dominant contribution that scholars especially can make to the understanding of what happened in 500 years of Christianity. So I'm very pleased. We have three participants today, and the order of presentation will be Brother Gaspar, Brother Karl, and then our other anthropologist also of the Ateneo de Manila, who is Fernando Zialcita, as well as Dr. Remmon Barbaza, who is with the philosophy department of the Ateneo. So we have a wonderful range of three people who have those issues and can, I think, will be able to detail them to you in very clear ways. So, if there's no other thing that Jillian thinks I should do or she should do, let me turn then to Brother Karl. You have 20 minutes for your presentation. So maybe call on Brother Karl.
Thank you very much, Mary. Good afternoon, everyone. The title of this presentation is Magsosori ba tayo? A proposal to meaningfully commemorate the 500th year of the encounter between our ancestors and the Spanish colonizers. In March 2021, which is just 8 months from now, the Philippines will celebrate the 500th year of the arrival of the Spanish conquistadores, accompanied by the friars of mainly religious congregations. The expedition, however, was a failure until Legazpi came to colonize the islands. From 1565 until 1898, a long period of more than 3 centuries, Las Islas Filipinas was Spain's main colony in Asia. The process of colonization, however, persisted during the American occupation until 1946. By March 2021, most of the citizens of this republic, especially those of us who are Roman Catholics, will be swept into triumphalistic celebrations, lacking in depth of meaning. I propose that apart from the tendency to highlight only the quote positive aspects of the introduction of Christianity to our people, that the Jubilee celebration provide us with the needed introspection to quote learn the lessons of history so we are not condemned to repeating the same mistakes. The 500th year commemoration is truly a jubilee year for us, but we should not lose sight of the biblical meaning of a jubilee year, which among others include humbly recognizing our transgressions against nature and other human persons, to seek forgiveness for such transgressions, and to provide relief to those who are in pain and suffering. During the Spanish Catholic Church was not only established across the country, except in areas that could not be penetrated by the Spanish forces, especially in the hinterlands where the indigenous peoples resided and Muslim Mindanao, but it got entrenched. Today, the Philippines is the country with the highest percentage of Roman Catholics, with 80.9% of the total population, indicating that they're Catholics by religious affiliation. However, we must remember that this evangelization campaign towards the proselytization of those that the colonizers considered as heathens, pagans, and uncivilized peoples occurred alongside a colonization project. The Catholic Church arrived in the Philippines as a close associate and partner of the Spanish Empire, and by virtue of the Patronato Real, it made sure that the sword was blessed by the cross. A foreign power imposed its will and control over what used to be baranganic communities who were free to rule themselves and had no masters to contend with in their everyday lives. The forced occupation of the islands of our ancestors unfolded with the blessings of a faith tradition that was founded by a carpenter, an itinerant preacher who preached about justice to the downtrodden and compassion for the needs of the lowly. Christianity was introduced to our ancestors within a socio-economic political system that forced people to relocate themselves from their natural habitat to resettlements for the sake of conversion and governance. While the natives eventually succumbed to the pressures of settling down in reductions, they had no inkling when it all began that this was just the beginning of how they will suffer the consequences of a colonial rule. Because of a number of reasons, including the limited resources of these islands, because we did not have the silver of Mexico or the spices of the Moluccas, nor was its agricultural economy providing large surplus or had great potentials in trade and commerce. The colonial power could only economically take advantage of the islands through extractions of goods and labor. Thus was introduced the system of the tribute, the polo y servicios or forced labor, and the vandala. All of these were very oppressive and resulted in major abuses committed by the colonizers against the hapless natives. From island to island across the archipelago, including attempts to introduce this in Muslim Mindanao, the natives had to endure the harsh brutalities of a regime that demanded much more than the people could produce, to the point where the needs of the colonizers were prioritized over those of their own families. Where they were not able to meet the colonizers' demands, there were imprisonments and floggings. In the beginning of the colonial rule, most of the abuses were committed by the Spanish colonial authorities, encomenderos, and soldiers. The bishops and the friars, mainly coming from the five major religious congregations, the Augustinians, Franciscans, Dominicans, the Jesuits, and the Recollects, at first strongly voiced out their concern over how the Spanish authorities abused the natives. They reported these violations of native rights to the king, who showed concern but was too far away to make a difference in stopping the abuses. However, eventually, as the priors also became encomenderos and later transformed their land estates into haciendas, some of them also turned abusive. Since the beginning of the colonial rule, our ancestors were suspicious as to the motives of the Spanish colonizers. Even as Magellan was welcomed by Raja Humabon, he was killed by Magellan. When Legazpi arrived in Cebu 44 years later, the Cebuanos resisted, and it took a while before he and his men could land in the island. Such was the case of de Goite when he first arrived in Manila, and in many other expeditions that they made across the archipelago. As the abuses worsened, revolts after revolts took place from the north to the south, rebellions in hot spots across the archipelago. Countless resistance movements arose. Before the rise of a national consciousness, rebellions took place mainly as sporadic response to localized oppressions. Eventually, however, these revolts expanded in terms of coverage and length of time, causing greater concern for the colonizers. It cannot be denied that the 333 years of Spanish colonial rule in the Philippines brought about some changes that proved beneficial to the country and our people. As an unintended consequence, the colonial rule provided the impetus for the conquered segment of the population a sense of nation, as the national revolution gave way to the setting up of a republic. Tapping into the barangganic system of governance provided the foundation of a native leadership that would later take over the reins of government. Unlike what took place in Latin America, they did not impose Spanish as an official language. Instead, they decoded the local languages and produced grammar books and dictionaries that proved valuable in advancing literacy in the country. The friars especially helped in eradicating some of the cultural practices that hindered people living in peace and security. For example, slavery, polygamy, and result in resolving conflicts that involved killing each other. But as a people, we paid a very high price for having to undergo the 3 centuries of colonial rule. It is, of course, impossible to calculate the number of our ancestors who suffered the consequences of this rule. Those whose houses were burned as the colonizers attacked settlements, those who were flogged and shamed in public, those imprisoned, and all those who fought in revolts who resisted the rule and died. But historical narratives are available to provide some inklings as to the extent of the crimes committed by the empire against humanity. Then there was the manner that Christianity was introduced, which should make us ask a lot of questions today. How did the Spanish friars conduct their evangelization campaign so that they were able to proselytize the people who were then the indigenous Bicolanos, Cebuanos, Ilocanos, Hiligaynon, Pampangueños, Pangasinenses, Tagalog, Waray, and other communities, to the point where Catholicism as religion got firmly established in those 8 major Christianized groups in the country. Can it not be said that all throughout the historical process, a chauvinist Christianity asserted itself to the point where it helped to destroy the fabric of a belief system that for centuries held the people's lives together in a symbolic manner that made possible living a most humane, just, and compassionate way of life? But considering that the Christian religion was integral to the empire's agenda of establishing a colonial rule, would it have been possible for the church to not be a party to this oppressive rule? And in fact, the avowed main justification for the occupation of the islands was the conversion of the natives. But we know, in fact, that it was the economic factor that pushed the expeditions to take place in the first place. One also has to recall the cultural fabric of Spain from the 15th to the 18th century. Taking pride in their superior status in the world, they considered some unconquered islands as their playground. Racism was a taken for granted element in how they treated natives, and they acted accordingly. And most of the friars were no different from the rest of the colonizers, which was why they had no qualms judging the natives' way of life, especially their indigenous belief system, as garbage and needed to be eradicated. As the Babaylans continued to have influence over the natives, they persisted in their attempts to completely vanquish the native religious practices to the point of persecuting, even eliminating the Babaylans. This was unfortunate as there were already Dominican theologians in Spain who already at that time preached about native rights based on the biblical insistence on the role of justice and righteousness. However, there must have been other theological discourses that were still dominant in the medieval Spanish church that convinced the empire that their colonial agenda to convert the natives to Christianity had a divine mandate. Relying also on the manner that Catholic indoctrination was being done in the New World, like those in the Platicas, it made the catechism classes very fundamentalist in orientation. So, what sort of Catholic religion was introduced in terms of doctrine, tenets, and practices, which has persisted until today in our country? We only have to discern the fruits of this evangelization process in the behavior of most Filipinos among the majority of Christians to see if the kind of Christianity that Jesus preached and was lived by the early Christian communities had become and has been sustained as a reality in our country. Look sadly at our reality and wonder if we can take pride in saying that until East Timor became independent, we were the only country in Asia with a majority Christian population. The legacy of the colonial rule has been the impoverishment of the great majority of our people, especially the peasants. The introduction of the Regalian doctrine and the encomienda system gave rise to land being owned and controlled by a few big landowners. For all the attempts at addressing the landlessness issue in the country, today a genuine land reform program remains elusive, which is one reason why the majority of our population remain poor. The income inequality of our country is so unbelievable, where the richest cent of our elite own a huge piece of the country's wealth. Government has always been controlled by the oligarchy, and those who can have influence are preferred in terms of their interests rather than those of the people's. And that is why very little by way of social services are hardly felt among those in the peripheries. Corruption in government and other institutions are so blatant that it has reached a level where it's almost impossible to even minimize it. And for many years now, whether under an authoritarian and so-called democratic regimes, our human rights and civil liberties are curtailed. The military and police, as is today with the EDGE case, are allowed to take on control to the point where they are no longer accountable to the law. There are churches and convents all over the place. There are Catholic schools, Catholic social agencies, radio stations, and other institutions. The church does have a dominant presence in this country, but does it translate into a society that is truly humane and compassionate, where justice, truth, harmony, and peace reign? In the light of the grave onslaught and imposition of a chauvinist Christianity carried out in erroneous ways during the past centuries, it is not appropriate in 2021 that we own up to our collective sins, ask forgiveness for this, and seek reparations on behalf of the descendants of the remaining indigenous communities who continue to be victimized by the various institutions of Philippine society. In seeking the indigenous people's forgiveness, what kind of reparations would be required from both the state and the church? It would seem that the just and righteous way to deal with this issue is to seek the indigenous people's thoughts and ideas, how their rights can be respected, especially in relationship to the ownership and control of the remaining ancestral domain, if only we are to make a difference in the life of the indigenous peoples today, especially to end their dislocation from the remaining ancestral domain, and to make sure that their rights are protected and respected by corporate firms, state agencies, and other outsiders. Because otherwise, there would have been no symbolic gesture appropriate for this Jubilee year. And for us, Filipino lowlanders, that we can develop a deeper appreciation of indigenous knowledge, skills, practices, and spiritualities in ways that benefit not just the indigenous peoples, but all of us Filipinos. After all, in this age of climate change and the impact of COVID-19, there's so much that we can learn from the indigenous knowledge systems that can help us deal with present day urgent issues. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you very much, Brother Karl. He has raised a very controversial concept of not so much not so much forgiveness. That's not so controversial, except forgiveness by whom, and reparations, of course, is another very newly thought out, I think, concept, at least in this country, I think. Let me just say before I introduce our next speaker that this roundtable is construed as a much more informal kind of event as opposed to the more traditional paper giving, even though some of our participants are using presentation style with papers. At the same time, we want to have the other two speak and then make their points and then have a conversation first among them for a while, but then open up, of course, to all the participants. And we have till 6 o'clock. So I think we should be able to have a good discussion of many people. Second, then, our next speaker presenter is Dr. Fernando Zialcita, who is an anthropologist. I won't give all the background that traditionally, but who is going to speak about a constructed dialogue between a missionary and the Ilongots. So here is an anthropologist who's done a lot of field work, whose specialty most recently is in cultural heritage, everyday lives of people, and now trying to imagine what that kind of conversation would be between a missionary and one particular group, Ilongot. So I'm very pleased to present Dr. Zialcita.
Thank you, Mary. I'll just read my speech. The new title is A Constructed Dialogue Between a 19th Century Missionary and the Ilongots. I hope I can be heard.
Yes, you're fine. Go ahead.
Okay, sure. Why would a foreigner dedicate his life to the conversion of small communities notorious for violent practices? How does he hope to convince them to convert? Conversely, how do the potential converts see conversion? In evaluating the 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines, I want to avoid two extremes: conceiving of the missionary as a fanatic avid for domination, and imagining the proselytized as irrational. I will construct an imaginary dialogue between the missionary and his prospective converts to present both sides, articulate underlying issues in the conversion process, and conclude my piece by pointing out what I see as relevant to me as an anthropologist who is a committed Catholic Filipino. The constructed dialogue is based on several documents. The first-person account by the Dominican missionary Buenaventura Campa of his work in northeastern Luzon in 1879, 1883, 1886, 1894. His reports were collated in 2016 into a single book by the historian Jorge Mojarro, entitled Entre las Tribus del Luzon Central. I like this work to dialogue with ethnographies written over a century later. The first is a classic 1980 ethnography, Knowledge and Passion by Michelle Rosaldo, an anthropologist who lived among Ilongots in the Sierra Madre in the 1970s to study why headhunting took place. Another one is an article by the anthropologist Shi Yuanyang in 2011 on his experience among the Ilongots, also called Bukalot, starting 2004. I like both because they're full of first-person narratives. Let us listen to what missionary and potential converts say about conversion. Born in Spain in 1852, Father Buenaventura Campa was sent by his order to the Philippines in 1877. In Manila, he could teach at the city or minister to the older Dominican parishes, for instance, Pangasinan, or work at the new parishes in Cagayan Valley. He chose the most difficult option, the third. Hearing of the headhunting raids by the Ilongots against Christians, he wanted to live among them and preach the faith. However, after several attempts, he was warned that he was risking his life, and so gave up. The pagans which he focused on instead were the Ifugaos, largely of Mayoyao. He took trips from his parish, Cagayan Valley, attempting to convince them to live in clustered settlements instead of in hamlets. He paid an initial visit to Ilongot settlements in 1891. There are two reasons in his narrative for wanting to convert. First is the standard Catholic vision. When he at last meets the Ilongots, by an interpreter, he urges all to recognize that there is but one God, the Father of all, whose Son died to save us. He stresses the absolute need for baptism as the door to salvation. A second reason is his horror at their practices. 3 Christians who went fishing in the river were found headless, dismembered, disemboweled. He fulminates against the injustice of the Ilongots acting freely, while Christians worked at their fields, obey the laws, and pay their dues to the government. Now let us listen to the Ilongots via Michelle Rosaldo's ethnography. Headhunting could be done against a perfectly harmless stranger, such as a beekeeper asking his Ilongot guide to lead him deeper into the forest. But while Campa attributes it to an instinct for blood, the Ilongots connected it to what they called liget. This raging energy, typical of men, must be released to be harnessed. When liget is trapped, a young man feels a heavy burden. He cannot assume his social responsibility of marrying and siring offsprings. So what act releases this energy? Cutting off a head. As the knife slashes through the victim's neck, the novice's rage is released, freeing him of all constraint. He can now rejoin his community as an adult. But what is done with the head? Practices vary according to the ethnic group. Among the Ilongots, the head is merely thrown up into the air, precisely as a gesture of release. According to the anthropologist Xu Yuanyang, who lived among the Ilongots starting in 2004, most had become Christians because of the new tribe's mission of evangelical persuasion. That mission had arrived in 1959 in the locality of Gingin. However, some men refused conversion because they wanted to headhunt as a preparation for marriage. Others, on the other hand, accepted baptism but could not resist wanting to behead a stranger. A Tagalog carpenter who had lived in Gingin for 2 years made furniture, but when he hiked alone between settlements, he was beheaded and dismembered. The early life when killed. Let us turn again to Father Campa. How did he convert the Ilongots? First was to convince them to give up their mode of subsistence. He scoffed at what he called their helter-skelter garden. He dreamt of bringing together the scattered hamlets into compact settlements where he could minister more easily to their needs, whether spiritual or material. He believed he needed the help of his order, the Dominican, in attending to their material needs. Third, he believed that to ensure success, the cross and the sword should work together. A garrison was needed to protect the converted and to deter attacks from the unconverted. However, we get a different picture from the Ilongots narratives. They were Swedeners. In Tagalog, magkakaingin. They were not agriculturists. After choosing a spot in the forest, the men cut the trees and burned the vegetation. Women planted varied crops within the enclosures to harvest throughout the year. After cultivating a garden for several years, the men moved to another spot in the forest while allowing the former garden to turn forest again. Coming from an agricultural background, Campa mistook forest gardens for disorder. However, Ilongot women told Michelle Rosaldo that they actually enjoyed seeing their rows of crops maturing to fruition. Moreover, as Swedeners, Ilongots probably had an easier time than agriculturists who needed to construct an elaborate irrigation infrastructure. And since nobody owned the forest, anybody could own a temporary garden. Anybody could open a temporary garden. No one was rich, but no one was poor either. So why indeed would an Ilongot Swedener give up an easy way of life to become the agriculturist that Father Campa envisioned? Plus, he would have to share part of his harvest as a tax to people living in the distant city. Let us now draw out broader issues in this dialogue. There are two issues I draw from this conversation. First is the need to understand customs different from ours. Second is the importance of creating communities where those who are not kin may imagine themselves as kin. As we saw, Father Campa misunderstood two basic features of Ilongot culture, the headhunting ritual and the preference for Sweden. Headhunting, as part of our Austronesian tradition, has thrived for millennia in Taiwan and other islands in Southeast Asia. It is not an aberration by any means. The frenzy is connected with the passage from youth to adulthood, from the vitiate to full membership in a community. True, it denies another self, however innocent, the right to life. On the other hand, it fulfills a very important function in the life cycle. Merely using military force or merely attending Catholic rituals will not extinguish the need, the hunger for frenzied violence. Know that Tagalog galit, probably cognative liget, denotes anger, but can also connote sexual arousal. So a young man wants to release his bottled up energy. What practices among us in the lowlands allow such a release? It's interesting to know that on the one hand, bloody initiation rituals in our university fraternities continue to thrive despite prohibition. I'm talking about Catholic universities. On the other hand, increasing multitudes now join the frenzied Nazareno and section. And practices may common wellspring that should be not be to the Ilongots than imagine ourselves. Father Campa also misunderstood the Ilongots' preference for Sweden in its classic form response to living on thickly forested slopes. Sweden is easier to practice than sedentary agriculture. It mimics the forest biodiversity and it yields food throughout the year. However, it can only be practiced where population density is low. In Shuyan's report, Ilongots gave up Sweden because their area was filling up with settlers. Father Campa did not understand either that Sweden engenders social equality. Father Campa's vision of many families living together in one large compact settlement actually goes back to the Synod of Manila in 1582. According to the Synod, such settlements helped the missionary in his ministry. It also encouraged the natives to care for each other. Now, this latter statement seems a strange claim until we realize that our ancestors interpreted the cosmos in terms of blood ties. The hamlet consisted of kin. Outsiders who were not kin were suspect against conflicts of intermarriage. Tyler, an anthropologist of the 19th century, observed that the English word kindness originally signified benevolence only towards one's own king. Among pagan Anglo-Saxons, the non-kin was suspect. The Hellenic ideal of living a life together with non-kin was propagated by the church. For in the parishes, the non-kin, hitherto regarded as an other, could be imagined as fellow siblings under one father. Our cities sprang up around such parishes. According to the geographer Robert Reed, while cities throughout Southeast Asia were already centuries old in the 16th century, they did not as yet exist in Luzon and Visayas of the period. Islamic Manila and Indigenous Cebu were en route to genuine urbanism. The missionaries, says Reed, facilitated urbanism by organizing parishes supported by sedentary agriculture and the plow. So here's my personal evaluation. Looking at the Spanish missionary enterprise, I see as positive the disappearance of headhunting from the Christianized areas of Luzon and Visayas. For the practice generated feuding between hamlets, which made it difficult to create larger, more compact settlements. However, I ask whether the crisis faced by a young man crossing over to adulthood has really disappeared. This has been covered, but I think this needs further investigation. In other words, we are really more connected to our indigenous past than we may imagine ourselves to be. I also see as positive the centrality of organizing parishes, the missionary enterprise. The parishes grew into urban centers interconnected with each other across the archipelago. Without them, our nation state would not exist. However, I now have my reservations. Current anthropological research has shown that urbanism itself, along with sedentary agriculture, is not an unmixed blessing. For the Swedener, both sedentary agriculture and living in a city signify the end of a world where inequality based on privately owned land did not exist. In his new world, he must yield to those with wealth and power. It's interesting that in Genesis, Abel, a shepherd, and therefore with no land to own, is favored over Cain, founder of both agriculture and cities. Yet, urbanism is inescapable. I think we should not be areas where people can Sweden if they want to. We should listen to both the proselytizer and the proselytized. Thank you.
Thank you also, Dr. Zialcita, for bringing in another dimension to filling in some of the spaces that Brother raised at the beginning. Now, often we see the role as philosophers bring it all together into a very meaningful approach. And that's why I'm very glad to introduce our third and last presenter, Dr. Remmon Barbaza of the Department of Philosophy of the Ateneo de Davao. Also written extensively on many issues that relate the political sphere to people's individual philosophies and the church role in that. Yes, Dr. Barbaza, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mary. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Nice to see Karl here also, and both Zialcita and others I know, former students. Good afternoon to all. So let me do the sharing of the screen. Whiteboard. Can you see it now?
Okay, yes, we can see your screen.
Yes, yes.
All right. Okay, play. Okay, so good afternoon once again. As Dr. Rosselli said earlier, this is really just a more of an informal kind of an exchange, a roundtable discussion, rather than a straightforward, more academic paper presentation. You'll have to excuse. Maybe you can hear the rooster from my neighbor. This is the only place where I can do my online meetings, but I have no control over the noise outside. So I think Mary and also Karl also was able to. Both were able to tell us about the need to think about narratives now. The question of or the coming celebration of the 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines could easily be simply an opportunity to be celebratory or even triumphant. And we don't want that to happen because that's not the only narrative that matters. So we want to question the narratives now. And I propose we have two narratives here at least. One is from the narrative of Christianity, and I want to focus from the perspective of Christianity to focus on the narrative of the Incarnation. But there's also the narrative of our indigenous peoples. I took this photograph sometime in 2012. These are the children in San Ildefonso of Casiguran, Aurora, up north. When I joined the protest march of the people of Casiguran to protest APECO. So narrative. You can completely ignore this. Absolutely nothing etymological about. I just playing around with the slides, native and narrative. But of course, etymologically, narrative comes from the root word to know, whereas native comes from the root word natus, which is to be born. So the Christian narrative and the indigenous narrative. I'd like to present as a kind of maybe topics or points of discussion, or what we might call thesis, to bring us to bring our discussion to greater focus. The first, the Christian narrative is the narrative of incarnation. As I've said, this is what I wish to focus on. Of course, there is not just one narrative of Christianity or the Christian experience, but I'd like to focus personally on the Incarnation. The Johannine narrative of the Incarnation is the narrative of God dwelling with us, of God becoming one like us, humans, and thereby bridging what is otherwise an unbridgeable distance. between mortals and the divine. The Christian narrative of the Incarnation must be distinguished from the narrative of Christianity as Christianization. So those are two different things. And I think it's important for us to not to confuse the two, right? There's also the Christian experience. I remember reading in college, if I remember correctly, the author Albert Nolan, Jesus Before Christianity, right? So Christianity as a historical event, but also the personal Christ experience. And then there's also, as I've said, the experience or the historical fact of bringing Christianity to other nations. So we need to be able to distinguish these senses of the word. Number 4, the narrative of Christianization is intertwined with colonization, notice, and therefore with violence. Now, the nature and extent of Christianity's complicity, and I'm trying to be careful here, assuming there is complicity. Some of you might think that I'm being too careful, but I'm just accommodating people who are not ready to admit or accept that we are complicit as Christians now. So let's just assume, assuming there is complicity, what is its nature and what is the extent? We need to be truthful and honest and humble and courageous also in determining the nature and extent of the violence that we may have inflicted upon our brothers and sisters, especially the indigenous peoples. 6, the violence of colonization often takes the form of displacement in many senses of the word. Number 7, the violence of displacement can be understood in the physical sense of being driven away from one's ancestral domain, of taking away one's native land and abode, but also in the sense of cultural displacement, primarily language, but also the way of life. 8, the narrative of God's dwelling with us humans stands opposed to the narrative of displacement of indigenous peoples. And this is the reason why I wish to focus from the side of Christianity to focus on the narrative of incarnation, because the way St. John the Evangelist depicted the incarnation is that of God dwelling with us. And not just dwelling with us, but allowing us human beings to find our dwelling place for the first time, perhaps. And this is so radically opposed. This indwelling, this dwelling of God, this God pitching tent with us, is so radically opposed to the violence of displacement, to the violence of driving away people who have long been living in the land that they have received from their ancestors. And thanks to Brother Karl Gaspar, I had a chance to see firsthand during my sabbatical in 2017, when he arranged for my visits to at least 2 Lumad communities, one in Bukidnon and another one in Davao Occidental. And I saw for myself how, this violence of displacement, and I've seen Lumad communities pitching tent on canals outside the land that had been taken away from them. So this is really incredibly offensive. And raging. Number 9, thus the celebration, commemoration, or the living out of Christianity without working for justice, for the displaced, indigenous peoples and standing in solidarity with them would be clearly hypocrisy. Now, some might find hypocrisy too strong a word, but if you look at its meaning, it comes from the Greek hypokrisis, from hupo, under, and krinein, to cut, to decide, to judge. And it's used originally in hypokrisis, acting of a theatrical part. So being hypocritical is just acting out. We're not really living something out, but just on the surface. So we need to see what is under. So when I use the word hypocritical, that's really what I mean, that our Christianity must not just be on the superficial level, but what is underneath. And underneath is a contradiction for as long as we are not confronting this very difficult part of our history. So number 10, and the last one, throughout the history of Christianity, there is also a voice and a conscience. We have to admit that also, albeit not the dominant one, that recognizes the Christian narrative of redemption that stands opposed to any form of subjugation. We must allow this voice to be heard more and more, so that Christians everywhere can become true to the source of their narrative. In other words, what I'm saying here is what I'm sharing with you as points for discussion these are really nothing new. From the dawn of Christianity, from the life of Jesus himself, those who followed Jesus, whether personally or institutionally, there had been pockets of communities, there have been voices that did recognize this. And up to now, we hear that. Unfortunately, it's not the dominant one. So the point is to make this voice heard more and more, so that they become no longer just on the sideline, but become the dominant, the central narrative. I'd like to end with some positive notes. One about Pope Francis. We have a very fascinating Pope, and people who are in institutions, we like to think about SWOT analysis. So you might think of Pope Francis as an incredible opportunity to push forward our desire to be more authentic to the sources, the wellspring, the roots of our faith. And why do I say that Pope Francis is particularly significant in this regard? Now, you must have read news where Pope Francis is saying, instead of us busying ourselves with converting others, we should live our lives more joyfully instead, so that if people find our lives attractive, then they will themselves perhaps consider our faith, our life. But gone is the age of directly converting people, which also can be seen as an act of violence. So Pope Francis, this is from a Reuters article online, the church grows not through proselytism, but by attraction. So, as it were, no hard sell. So this means, again, reading from the quote from Pope Francis, this means, dear friends, that our mission as baptized persons, priests, and consecrated men and women is not really determined by the number or size of spaces that we occupy, but rather by our capacity to generate change and awaken wonder and compassion. The Pope affirms Catholic Church's duty to indigenous Amazonians. You have a lot of news reports on the Pope really making explicit statements about recognizing not only the harm that we have done against indigenous peoples, but the way for us to reconcile. No? It begins with asking for forgiveness. No? So it's not a favor to them, but it's really returning back to what originally belonged to them. There's another here article. The Pope says indigenous people must have the final say about their land. And finally, I said 2 points, 2 positive points. One about the Pope. In the Philippines, I've mentioned this to Brother Karl Gaspar, and I think also to my group with Mary. We have in the Philippine Jesuits, they have this document, the roadmap of the Philippine province now. And the reason why I actually went to Mindanao during my sabbatical was because I was inspired by this document. But again, the document is one thing, but actually pursuing it, living it out is another thing. And I think the Jesuits themselves, the leadership, admit that they have not fully pursued what is otherwise a promising vision. So let me end with a part of this roadmap. It says, recognizing the priorities of the Universal Society of Jesus, especially those of the Jesuit Conference of Asia Pacific, to give special attention to Myanmar, East Timor, and Cambodia, will direct greater apostolic focus, preference, resources, and energies to Mindanao. And that includes research, right? For those Jesuits engaged in education. Particularly to the following specific conditions and communities in Mindanao: the continuing poverty and marginalization of peoples, specifically the most impoverished among the indigenous peoples and Muslim communities; the pervasive military conflicts between government and rebel groups in many areas, which inflict violence on the IPs and cause massive displacements. So these are just 2, and I'm sure you have encountered other points that are positive, that give us all hope and encouragement to move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Barbaza. All the 3 participants, I think, have brought out certain themes that much happened in the past after Spain came to the people of the country, and you kind of had 2 branches, you might say, that separated from one another in many ways. That 85% or 80% Christian Filipino today, lowland so-called, and then the indigenous peoples who are identified as that. And the question everyone, I think all 3 are saying, all right, in light of all that, what now? What is our responsibility both to the indigenous people, as we now call them, that minority, when we used to be the majority, really, 500 years ago. What's the responsibility of majority to them? But what's the responsibility of the majority to itself? And this is what Brother Gaspar is saying. What kind of Christianity then have we developed? Should we really be proud of that? And actually, Dr. Barbaza is saying the same, and so is Dr. Zialcita. So we have to understand what kind of Christianity have we, if not inherited, remade into who we are today, and why is that, right? Now, we're not saying it's the fault of the church. It's a whole social, globalization, everything that comes with it. But we need to begin to look at it, to separate the pieces, make himay here, right? We say, but without forgetting that there is that 15% or so, even sometimes 20, who are left not only marginalized but subjected to further violence. Is what you're saying. Let me say that for those of us who are in Metro Manila, we tend to think that's far away. The Bungkolots, it's in the mountains in the north. Let me just read you a statement we just got from an Aita living in Sierra Madre Mountains, facing the already bulldozers moving in their area because of the Kaliwat Dam. is going to be built on the settlement despite massive resistance from them, from many NGOs, religious groups, a few government people, but it seems inexorable. The Build, Build, Build program is determined to build Kaliwa Dam. Here is what one of the leaders of the AGTA there saying, you know, what we were really the protectors of this environment. It's not just for us, it's for everybody. All those people in Manila who think we're against them because we don't want them to get water from this dam, do they know that if we allow these forests to be cut down, they will have no more water. It's the trees that create water and so on and so on. So they see themselves as the protector. Anyway, he ended his talk, and let me just close, this is very short. He ended his talk to remind the Metro Manilans who government in a way has pitched against them. You know, it's against, because we want the water and they're keeping us from doing it by insisting on their ancestral domain rights. He said, Mr. Marcelino Tena of Sagibin, which is their organization, we indigenous people live the forest. It is our hospital, our source of medicine. It's our food, our school for learning. Here lie the sacred burial grounds of our ancestors. So deeply rooted are we to our forest that if we are cut off from it, we will disappear as a people. They live next door practically in the Sierra Madre. So this is not one of those distant issues for Metro Manila. It's a real issue. And I think our three speakers have encapsulated into a set of problems, which now actually I would like maybe the three of you to interrogate each other, if you want to look at it that way. Raise some of the other issues you think the others have contributed to your thinking. Let's give ourselves maybe 10 or 15 minutes for that, and then we'll open it up to the audience, right? So who would like to start? Any one of you? I never saw males who didn't want to begin to say something. Come on, Brother Karl, you're always since you started all of this, so why don't you take the responsibility to move us further?
Thank you, Mary. In terms of something very concrete, I think there are a number of things that I would really like to propose. In fact, you know, taking off from what Remmon said about the Jesuit province thrust towards Mindanao and dealing with the indigenous peoples and the Muslim people's problems, I was very much involved in the beginning of the writing of that paper because naturally my association with the Jesuits at Ateneo de Davao provided me some kind of a privileged position to be able to give feedback, especially at the time when it was Father Karl who was made in charge to look into it. And eventually I did propose something to Father Joel Tabora, because there are three areas where I think something concrete can be done and where the Jesuits can really play a part. And of course, in conjunction with the Episcopal Commission of Indigenous People and the local dioceses in Mindanao, which have very considerable population of Lumad. One area, of course, is the big issue of ancestral domain, because until today, the NCIP's performance in terms of the implementation of IPRA is very problematic. While there are good experiences here and there, the dominant experience has been really very problematic. And in fact, there are more and more research studies in the field by various groups, anthropologists, NGOs, faith-based groups to indicate that there are more failures than successes in this particular area. And yet, when the IPRA was being crafted, the church took a very strong position in terms of supporting that initiative. And that's why I proposed to the Episcopal Commission of Indigenous Peoples to really look into how they can retrieve some of the momentum of because it would seem as if after the law was passed, there was very little by way of the bishops asserting their right to monitor what was taking place with the IPRA. And I was suggesting that one concrete way by which we can really do something about this next year for the Jubilee year is for the bishops to establish very direct sort of linkages to the NCIP and whatever other government agencies should be involved to look again at the whole implementation of IPRA, because that is where the state and the church can cooperate to do something about this land issue. For the state to be able to allocate more funds, because funds are always a problem, and for the church to be able to provide its solidarity support here. But meanwhile, according to the feedback of many of those in the field, there really is a need to assess the implementation rules and regulations of this law, because there have really been very many loopholes. Going back to what I said about Father Joel Tabora, there was a conference here at the Ateneo de Davao about more than a year ago, where it took up from that Jesuit province thrust of dealing with the problems of the indigenous people, because clearly the other issue that is very urgent, not just here in Mindanao, but throughout the Philippines, is how do we deal with the peace and order condition, given that the indigenous peoples are oftentimes caught between the military force of the armed forces of the Philippines on one side and the CPP-NPA on the other side. And we know from news reports that there have been many incidents where the indigenous peoples are really caught in between, and there's a lot of harassment owing to the suspicion that many of them are very supportive of the CPP-NPA. And it would seem to be that, like the bishop ulama role in the conflict situation of the MNLF, MILF, and the government, they could play that role too, because while it is far more complex and it will involve a lot more work, something has to be done. Unless that issue gets resolved somehow, the peace and order condition will remain. And lastly, as with the dam issue that Mary had mentioned, it's all these development projects that are penetrating the interior among the uplands, no, mining and continuing logging and the dam and so on. Even the government's desire to look into energy mobilization projects. These are really projects, and usually they cost so much, no, and the budgets are very high. But in fact, the cost of suffering of the people is also very high. And again, there can be something that can be done by way of advocacy in those areas. So even if these three areas can be, can be responded to in innovative and creative ways, so that we can really move in the resolution of these issues, that will be something to make us be appreciative of why there is this Jubilee celebration next year.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. You bring in really some practical steps forward, and the other two might like to discuss. The audience might like to have comments on it too. Let me just say that one new level of awareness that many of us have gotten as a result of this pandemic is that our upland people are telling us, if you keep disturbing the forest, the zoonotic elements of generating the viruses which are inherently there, which get disturbed, because then you have transmission from wildlife to animals to humans, our issues of virus will never end. That is, this one might stop, but there will be new ones if we don't recognize the validity of protecting the forest. And that's why the IPs who are there, see that they are the ones who really feel they have that responsibility. It's a God-given one, part of their spiritual domain, which is also their ancestral domain. Right, so let me see, Butch
I just want to say something, Mary.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, please. I agree. Definitely, we must apologize to our indigenous brethren, because after all, Christianity revolves around the sacrifice of Christ, who precisely was protesting against the imperial powers, namely Rome. And for that, he was sacrificed. So it's really unconscionable that Christianity has made use of force through this millennia. It's really unfortunate that there has been an alliance between Christianity and the state since the 5th century, practically down to Vatican II, because many Catholics accepted the reality that for Catholicism to be protected and spread, it needed the protection of state powers. And we know this has led to abuse. So I'm glad that's over. And perhaps because of this, we can now work in partnerships with people who are not of the same faith, people who don't share the same religious worldview. Now, the second thing I wanted to point out is that part of the problem we have in dealing with indigenous peoples is that we don't really study enough our indigenous tradition. I don't see this in our schools. I don't see it in our textbooks. Usually the textbooks just give about 1 chapter or 2 about indigenous peoples. And then they start immediately with the Spanish period. Even that is short. And they finally emphasize the 19th century revolution. So there's this disconnect. I brought this thing up about the Ilongot, the frenzy, and the frenzied processions we have in the lowlands. We think we're so superior, so distant, but actually there might be a connection. And I think we should look deeper into the continuity between our culture and their culture, so we don't start feeling superior. I would also like to suggest perhaps a more nuanced view of property relations during the Spanish period. First of all, there's really no connection between the encomienda and the hacienda, because encomienda was basically a grant given to the conquistadores and their native allies to exact tribute. But that was disbanded by the end of the 17th century because the Spanish king feared it would lead to feudalism. Now, the hacienda. I was reading After the Galleon by Benito Legarda, economic historian. He points out that actually down to the end of the 19th century, most farms in the Philippines were small and were run by their owners. In other words, they were the producers or the owners themselves. The large haciendas began to appear in the sugar-producing provinces, Pampanga and Negros. Now, he said the real problem started with the American period, with Torrance title, because a lot of the lands were not titled. The tendency was for people with connections to take advantage.
In that case, Dr. Barbaza, why don't you come in? I'm still looking for my picture. And then after that, unless somebody still wants to add something, let's move it into the larger participation group. So please, Dr. Barbaza, your sort of last round comment.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. I just wanted to follow up on what Dr. Zialcita has already said, that in terms of learning about, studying our various indigenous peoples and their cultures, the language, as I told you earlier, I had the chance to visit the 2 Lumad communities in Mindanao, and just being exposed to just 2 communities had given me incredible insight into a whole world that is so unheard of as far as we're concerned, but then has so much to teach us. For instance, in the community known as Tagakaulo, they call their god, Chumanum, the one who planted. So their relationship with their god is in terms of planting. So whenever they get something from the forest, before they do that, they have this ritual of asking permission, very, very respectful of the environment. And it's all in the language. And even linguists say, the Philippines has, I don't know now how many, 180 different languages or more, not counting the dialects. and just one language is a repository of medicinal knowledge, environmental knowledge. So just even in that realm, in pursuing serious studies, just even descriptive, and just getting to know what is there, in terms of the lives, the culture, the language, the habits of these people. There's already so much to be done and to be for us to learn from.
Yeah, thank you. Let's make one comment on my own. I work mainly with urban informal settlements, people who are considered informal settlers. They used to be called squatters, but fortunately, that term is no longer used properly in certain circles. One of the things it so struck me when you talk to people, they move into public space. Let's say the areas around Congress, which were supposed to become the area of, the capital, or new capital of Manila, but there was all this open space. And when you talk to them, of course, from the government and public sector or the private sector point of view, that's a violation. They're squatters. But from their point of view, if you have an open space which is not being used and nobody seems to be preventing you from using it, you can go in and use it because you need it. And that, I think, it's really what Dr. Zialcita said. I think all of you are saying that there is a wellspring of the pre-Spanish value traditions which carry over into today. And that notion of I have sort of rights, I have rights if nobody stops me and it's an open space that's not used and I need it very much, then it's okay if I'm there. It's not illegal. The notion is they're told it's illegal, but is it wrong? No. From their point of view, it's not wrong because it comes out of a different value set from what that was brought in by Spanish colonization and American colonization also. So I think you're right when you say we need to study that not as kind of only as past traditions, but that is part of the culture today, even of the dominant society, which we don't want to recognize because we say, oh, that's superstitious or whatever. Go to those people, go to spirit people. It's part of their everyday lives. Even they're mainly maybe the bottom 50% because they don't have options to go to the modern medical sector, too expensive. And they feel this is the way that they have always somehow gotten cured. So we need, I think, to understand what are the well springs, even of our values today, which really date back to those things and times. And the indigenous people today are the ones who still articulated in their own lives in the protecting of the environment and so on, and looking at their lives as a holistic set of situations. Okay, so let me open up. Let me ask Jillian. I don't know how we do this, Jillian, to open up to the audience. So why don't you take over and select people, and we will ask them to either direct a question to any one particular one, or to all panelists for commentary. Or it doesn't even have to be a question. It can be your own observation, but please no more than 3 minutes per person, right? So that we get a maximum participation. So Jillian, can you help us organize this super technically great challenge for me?
Okay, great. So first off, those who would like to share their thoughts or ask questions or even comment, maybe contend with any of the points shared by any of our speakers, please use the raise hand function in Zoom and turn on your videos so that we can call on you. Otherwise, if you're feeling a little shy, feel free to make use of the chat box to make use of the chat box. I've also opened the floor for people on our YouTube audience right now to share their thoughts and participate in the conversation through the comments there as well. Okay, so that being said, so I see Estella. Estella would like to say something. Please feel free to unmute and share your video with us.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I really love the sharing of thoughts in terms of this particular topic because it's also connected to my topic tomorrow. So, particularly, I would like to focus on again in terms of how we handle indigenous spirituality. So, when we say indigenous spirituality, it is rather an opposing factor when we present Christianity, as we would like to see it. So when we say that, it's more of what is our take in terms of indigenous spirituality? Is it really more on, do we look at them as do we look at it as primitive, backward, and worst of all, of the devil? So the urge to convert, to save the people from the devil, from the earlier times up to this point perhaps, would be a point of contention. When we talk about Christianity, are we really being Christians by being compassionate, no? In terms of how we treat indigenous spirituality? Second point is in terms of the modernization theory, to modernize. So when we modernize, of course, we have to eradicate those things that we consider as unmodern or not so modern or so backward. And that would be including all those places wherein we could put up dams, we could put up plantations in the name of economic progress. So in a way, what is the role of the church? So we can ask that. Of course, the church is doing a lot of things, but at the same time, what about the Christians, who are actually, some of them actually promoting this kind of modernization thing, particularly when we do build, no? So we encroach on sacred spots, sacred places. So for me, because I'm also doing research in terms of indigenous spirituality, it is important to know that we have to use a certain sense of lens, or we have to use a certain framework in order to understand. I always say this, I'm in the field of history. There's a tendency to use presentism. That is to, in a way, interpret what is happening in terms of our standard today. We interpret the indigenous in terms of our modernized or contemporary way of thinking, even using theories to interpret them. So, in a sense, I always believe that we have to study the indigenous people, indigenous culture, indigenous spirituality, but there has to be a certain framework that would go beyond what is being used by the usual Western theories, to go back into themselves, to teach their own, as it were, Weltanschauung, the way of looking at things. And perhaps we also try, we enter their world to really understand that, to enter their context. So I guess this is an important start of conversation in terms of how we handle the indigenous, especially if we talk about nation building. Do we include them as Filipinos really? Do we identify them as part of the nation, or do we eradicate them because they are against what we know as nation? So since nationalism or even nation itself is discriminating, so you have to qualify people in terms of that. So those are the thoughts that are running in my mind at this point as I listen to sharing. Thank you.
Thank you. May I comment on that? Okay, I mentioned the fact that for centuries the church has resorted to this union between itself and the state as a barrier to understanding the other. I think another barrier has been the cosmology itself of the church, where the world is seen as a battle between the forces of God and the forces of the devil, because whatever doesn't seem familiar, whatever is strange, is seen as devilish. And the church has made recourse to precisely the Old Testament, where the prophets warred against the idols or the pagan neighbors. So the church has actually warred against heretics, dissidents, and in the 19th century against secularists for being precisely in league with the devil. But I'm glad this kind of theology is disappearing. So when it is precisely this notion that the world is either for God or for the devil that has led to the need for conversion. You have to turn to be saved. So what Francis is saying is that actually it's not, we're no longer talking about conversion. It's living a life of honesty, of simplicity, of sincerity, according to one's faith, and being kind to others, that should be respected. But unfortunately, there are conservative elements who think he's deviating from traditional Catholic teaching. So they want him to use the word convert. But really, for me, at the heart of the problem, really, the relationship between the church, not only with indigenous peoples here, but with other peoples who don't agree with it, is really the two things: traditional recourse to using the state as an ally, and the other one is thinking of the world in terms of a battleground between the forces of God and the forces of the devil.
Can I add to that too?
Yes, of course, please.
Within the theological discourse now, that's popular among both Catholics and Protestants who are taking on a very different lens in looking at this particular theological reality. What is becoming more and more popular is the notion of indigenous knowledge, skills, practices, and spirituality. The state agencies promoting IP education will only involve indigenous knowledge, skills, and practices. But spirituality is a very important and integral element because it's part of the holistic understanding of what indigenous spirituality is all about. We have to take a particular position of really recognizing indigenous belief system as a faith tradition in itself. In fact, it is the mother religion of all other religions that have arisen in the world, which mainly arose in the Neolithic period. But indigenous religious system has been there for millions of years and have been responsible for people being able to survive the vicissitudes of life. And when we speak about indigenous spirituality, it is so interlinked with the whole notion of ecology, because the narratives, the epic stories, the rituals, what the Babaylans do, all of that are so intertwined with nature, and that's why, as Remmon mentioned, with the Tagakolo, even the words used, the languages, the stories, and so on are very reflective of how indigenous peoples relate themselves to the soil, to the lakes, to the waters, to the clouds, and so on. And this, I think, what earlier that part of what we lowland Filipinos should really be more able to appreciate. And I do agree with Dr. Zialcita when he says there's really need for us to be able to educate ourselves better in this particular field, that it is by our discovering the roots of our indigenous ancestors in their own indigenous belief system that we too can be benefited. And that is why today, in terms of the church here in Mindanao, just as there has been a movement towards doing interfaith, interreligious dialogue with Muslims, it is no longer conversion or even enculturation that we're emphasizing. But wherever the remnants of indigenous belief systems still exist, that priests, missionaries, lay people, catechists, and so on, who are in the field, should really be engaged in interfaith, interreligious dialogue with our indigenous peoples, because it is our ability to be able to also know more and appreciate better and maybe even integrate some of these elements of this spirituality into our own lives that we can face a better future, a more promising one.
Yeah, so maybe I can just to say a few things also. Thank you, Estella, for your question. I think that's a very important question. The framework, when we, studying a culture can also be an act of violence, right? Depending on how we go about it. And we've heard people say the poor are overstudied. It's time to study the rich. We can easily go to slum areas, but we can't go to Forbes to study the lifestyle of the rich, right? So it's a one-way thing, right? So that's a very important question. No? So it's not just the framework, but I think also the method, the way of doing it, the whole attitude. when we I remember my undergrad degree is linguistics from UP Diliman, and I remember in our field linguistics in an Agta community in Bataan, the elder before we stayed there for 2 nights, but on the first night, the elder told us very, very seriously, "You're welcome here. You will study our language, we know, but please don't play with our language." And he said it very, very seriously, and I can't forget that. I said, as an undergrad, what did I know? We were there just to study the language, but studying is not always interest free, right? So that's a very important question, and to my mind, an important when I say we need to study more the lives, the culture, the language of indigenous peoples. It's really more to learn from what is already there. So one method or one way of doing it is what we might call non-judgmental. We call it in phenomenology, for instance, in philosophy, as a method, is when we bracket prejudices. We don't rush ahead into making value judgments about what we see in a culture and in a language. We just, as much as possible, we stay in the description. The way, let's say, when we study, beavers, beavers make dams, right? So it's not just humans who make dams. Beavers also make dams. But then it's always just appropriate. They never overdo it, right? From our perspective, they don't make that, as Mary was saying, the Kaliwa Dam is really, really excessive. But again, the question of what is excessive, what is just right, what is just appropriate, there's a lot to be learned from the natural way of doing it, right? I see that also when I go scuba diving, and I'm so amazed at how the underwater world, in Nemo and all the other fishes, they have a sense of territory, right? They don't have a piece of paper like private property. And yet they somehow know, they have a sense of encroaching into someone else's territory. And somehow they respect each other, right? And we saw that in the pandemic, right? We've been immobilized by transportation. I live in a gated village, and I know my gated villages obstruct movements. Gated villages are like small intramuroses, right? We had a professor before, Ateneo, said, Maginhawa should be just one straight walk, but we have to go around. Maginhawa should be very near, but because of these gated villages, then we need to go around. And we saw that in the pandemic, how mobility has been, a problem, and that has all to do with, things like, private property, and we need to rethink that. And to do that, we need to learn again. This might sound too romantic. Look at the birds of the air, as Jesus said. Look at the birds of the air, the lilies of the field. It's poetic, it's romantic, but it actually makes a lot of scientific sense, right? Because the natural world, left on its own, knows its limits, knows what is appropriate.
Other questions coming in?
Okay, does anyone else have any questions? Once again, please feel free to raise your hand or to use the chat box for your questions.
Or comments. It doesn't have to be questions only. Comments is fine. Would be fine.
Any comments or any ideas you'd like to share? We have a commenter on YouTube who would like to who actually wanted to share about an experience they had in Mindanao. They're talking about how a non-Indigenous person applied for a title for the ancestral land of an Indigenous group. But the end result of it was that the 5 Indigenous people, who I presume were living on that land, it seems that they were put to jail in favor of this non-ID person who simply applied for a title to own that land. So what are your thoughts on this phenomenon? Because it seems like this is something that happens actually not just in the provinces, but I think we experience something like that here as well in urban spaces.
I think it's a question for Karl, no?
I thought you wanted to say something. Yeah, certainly. Well, already I've said that really the most urgent issue we are faced here in Mindanao continues to be the displacement of many of our indigenous peoples. And even as we're sitting here together, it continues to take place. And there are a number of reasons behind this. Number one, militarization is still persisting, where many of these corporate interests still are very aggressive, despite the fact that there are some setbacks owing to the pandemic. But recently, for example, we have heard that the Sagittarius mines in Pampacan, in South Cotabato, that the DNR again has reissued their license to be engaged in the kind of open pit mining that they have wanted to do. And it would seem as if where before the LGU had opposed it, that the present LGU, which has new members after the last election, are much more open to providing that kind of a solidarity support. And so that's again a lot of concern on the part of the advocacy groups there, including the Diocese of Marbel, the bishop and the clergy and the lay people there, and the basic legal communities who have, through the years, the last 25 years, been providing support to the Blaan to resist the encroachment of the mining corporations. But what is even worse is in parts of Surigao del Sur, where the logging operations and the mining operations have taken on a very aggressive stance by way of soliciting or mobilizing government troop support. And that's why a lot of red tagging and harassment of leaders and so on are continuing to take place. And where people are forced to dislocate because of the fear of their lives, become again another reason for their displacements. In Bukidnon, and Remmon would be quite familiar with this because he was there, the expansion of the plantations continued to take place. There's no end to it because cash crops are still our way to produce wealth. And Bukidnon, because of its land, its climate, and so on, is just suited to that. But apart from that, what is also very worrisome in terms of the dislocation of ancestral domains of all our indigenous people is the fact that there is a very strong urge on their part to try to escape from the poverty of the hinterlands, no, because of a combination of all these factors. So young people, for example, are pressured to really make decisions on their own. And so you have a growing number of young indigenous kids who are moving from the hinterlands down to urban centers, wherever it's nearest to them. So, for example, those in the mountains of Davao Occidental and South Cotabato would move to Jensan. Those who are around the Davao region would come down to Davao City searching for work. And of course, when the lockdown took place, you can imagine the problems related to migrant laborers in an urban center. So it's really a very serious problem, and it continues to be so. And that's why I'm, I'm very aggressive and very militant in terms of my strong position that we really have to do something about this. And 2021 provides us a very strong, a very important occasion to be able to at least do more than what we're able to do now.
May I just comment about land rights? This may seem incredible, but yeah, I really believe part of the problem really is the overemphasis on private property. Okay, now, especially with the growth of plantations, enables the wealthy to want to grab more land. It reminds me a lot of the situation in Mexico before the 1910 revolution, where neoliberalism was on the upsurge. So a lot of the communal lands were being taken away and divided. So what they did was they incorporated to the Mexican Constitution a feature that, strangely enough, was found actually in traditional laws of the Indies, namely that every municipality had to have a communal land, which could be used only by members, by the residents of the municipality. What the previous law would do was that it would be raffled out every so many years, so that people who didn't have land could use it. So this idea of having an ejido, was incorporated into the Mexican Constitution, and that was actually what Zapata was fighting for. So actually, when you talk about communal lands as the product of the Mexican Revolution, it was really that as a member of a municipality you could have access to the land. So that actually helped create a stronger middle class, took millions out of poverty. Unfortunately, with neoliberalism in the late 20th century, the ejido was scrapped, which drove many farmers in Mexico back into poverty. So, but I'm just saying, we might really look for that. To go back to the notion that as a member of a municipality, you have to have access to land, because I'm really worried about people migrating to the city because they become just a part of an anonymous, alienated proletariat. They lose all their identity and they're demoralized. They end up in the slums.
Yeah, if I can add to that, it's interesting that with the Urban Development Housing Act in 1992, the provision was very far-reaching for social reform affecting the urban poor. And one of the important parts of it was that local governments were supposed to do an assessment of their land situation in their area and set aside areas for what is called social housing, to house their own poor, that was the concept, so that their own small city at the time, perhaps outside Manila, could build up and integrate those who can't afford to buy land that's expensive, but have a place in the city because they belong there. They're part of the community. However, that was never, mostly not followed. And the other element of the 20% of all those who are the construction groups allocates 20% of the value of that for land for the urban poor, especially those who are displaced from that construction site. In reality, that never happened either, because initially those construction companies or developers, they're social developers, would buy land in Palawan, Mindoro, and that was considered sufficient to fulfill their obligation for the urban poor who are going to be displaced in the city, who have no idea what to do in Palawan, would never go anyway. But the distortion was very clear, and the case was brought to court, and the government, they won that side, that they could do that, or they could buy bonds, and that settled that. And those bonds didn't really go for the benefit of the poor. So, this business of you can have laws which are very important because at least they give basis for people to struggle if they can use it. But it is so skewed in terms of how it's implemented, and depends on who the judges are, how they interpret that, because these are new concepts. Even though land, the most traditional of land belongs to everybody, some have rights if they use it properly, et cetera, which I said before. But that's lost in the whole, the development of the whole colonial land system. There's always a call for, land reform, but so far, land issues, that doesn't happen. So, there's a question here from Ray Sanchez. I don't know if you've seen it, Jillian.
Oh, yes.
Maybe you can call on her.
Yes. So I was going to read it out. Okay, so from Ray Sanchez in the chat box about the question, Magsosori ba tayo? Who would you consider as tayo? As was said earlier, Christianity has become quite heterogeneous. Are you referring to lowlanders apologizing? the church, but then there are also indigenous people who are Christians. In addition to the question of Magsosori ba tayo, do we also demand that Magsosori sila, although they're not so sure who sila would refer to? Spain, Rome, the church hierarchy, the neo-colonizers, and lastly, who would we consider as having a say in accepting the apology, and how do we know if it was accepted?
Well, I just answered in the chat my response to that question, but so that everyone will be able to know what I wrote, I'll just summarize some of this. As I said here in the response, you can do it in sort of segments. It's not something like a huge, big thing that can happen at one time. As we have already proposed in some of our meetings in the Episcopal Commission on Indigenous People, this can be done at different tracks. For example, and that's why we had a conference one time at De La Salle the other year, where we brought together the representatives of the 5 religious congregations, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, the Recollects, the Jesuits, and the Franciscans. The idea was to try to bring the 5 religious congregations into a realization of what happened with their missionary agenda. And if they too can join in the reflection of how they can look back to their missionary enterprise, see where the transgressions or the omissions took place, and then challenge their leadership and their membership to be able to do something now. If they have missions among indigenous people, that they strengthen it, they allocate more funds to it, they provide a lot of scholarship because they have a lot of Catholic schools, things like that can be that are doable and something very concrete and doesn't have to be very ambitious. Secondly, the CBCP, they still represent officially the institutional church. And while it is true that during the Spanish colonial rule, there were bishops, especially the first Archbishop of Manila, that did try to raise his prophetic voice against the abuses of the native rights. Towards the end, they were really quite silent about it. No? Pope John Paul II at the end of the millennium, at the beginning of the new millennium, came up with a sorry statement against those that the church either abused or did not pay attention to, including women. You remember that there was a whole list, and that was taken very well by this group. So we were proposing, but of course the Episcopal Commission bishops are not sure how the membership of the CBCP will take it up, but they said they were going to discuss it, that sometime next year there can be some kind of a ritual where you can symbolically again express it and to show a concrete reparations, if you use the word, because since when? Since after Vatican II, there was a very strong thrust that dioceses with considerable IP population should have a strong IP ministry. But if you assess where these ministries are today, they're very weak because there's very little support by way of finance and personnel that the bishops provide. And that's why there are only a few pockets here and there of dioceses that are seriously doing something that provides solidarity to the indigenous people. So that can be done at that level. Thirdly, and it's been done, we did something in Butuan just before the lockdown. This was just a week before the lockdown to show that it can be done again at a smaller level. This was supposed to be done this year from diocese to diocese. The IP ministry was going to organize the meeting between the local bishop and the clergy and the religious in that area with the babaylans, because there still are a number of them out there and they're still practicing their indigenous belief system. They would be the ones to best represent the people and to be the ones who would say, yes, we are open to you telling us that you sinned against this. And we did something in Butuan which was very eye it was an eye opener. There were 8 bishops from Mindanao, and there were about 50 billions from Misamis Oriental, Agusan, Surigao, because these are just the Higaonon billions. And it was a very interesting ritual. It took a whole day where they listened to each other, and the billions expressed their sentiments against the church through the years. And then the bishops owned to this, and there was a ritual of reconciliation. So it really can be done. So we're not thinking of something huge and ambitious and so on and so forth. We do it in pockets, but with the intent that maybe something can happen. A doable activity can be done so that at least there's something symbolic that we can offer.
I still think we should apologize. We start with the layman, educated Catholic layman. I think we should start by trying to appreciate the indigenous heritage instead of looking down on it. We tend to assume this arrogant posture that we're superior, that we cannot learn anything from the indigenous. That's why I'm decrying the fact that in our books, there's hardly any mention of indigenous heritage, and yet there's so much to learn. Then we should also start with the bishops, because although union of church and state is no longer acceptable officially, but nonetheless, I still feel that the bishops tend to pull strings in the state to make their positions bear upon the majority. I still feel the bishops still tend to pull strings. They throw their weight around to make their influence thwart the majority.
Let's get Remmon, if you want your last point, and then I'll do one last round, and then we will end, I think, this session.
I have nothing to add, Mary. Thank you.
Okay, so let me say thank you to all of those who submitted questions, and of course to our panelists. Let me just conclude by saying, on the saying sorry side, this is not an out of the world idea. New Zealand government has apologized to the Maori for what they did to them. There are very strong forces in Australia that are forcing the government to do more than they've done to express what they have done to the native populations of Australia. And the apology to the Japanese for the concentration camps during the war by the US. Now, just very recently, New Mexico in the US, a judge gave a huge area of New Mexico, recognized that is really their indigenous territory. So this is I don't know if you'd say it's a movement, but it's happening. There is a recognition that such violations have taken place. So it's very timely that in the Philippines, we should also look at it and see where. Of course, and what you're saying, yes, the church may, the church has to recognize what it contributed to, but the rest of the non-church, that is the laity, also has responsibilities, and that's what's been pointed out, right? Let me say that I hope you found this a very stimulating conversation. Tomorrow, there will be another one, the last one, and that one is organized around gender, and you heard already Estela, who came in, she will make her paper. Rachel, who asked a question, is going to talk about giving the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene a makeover. And I will do something on the images of women in different colonial contexts. And Jael Cornelli will talk about militant Christianity today. So we hope you will join us. And as kind of my last statement about, can we really do these things? They seem so staggering. And you just start with who you are, where you are. And let me just last quote from Margaret Mead. Being an anthropologist, we, of course, very, very biased. But she said, the anthropologist Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So on that note, let's all change the world in the ways we can do it, and we can. We hope to see you tomorrow. Have a very pleasant evening. Thank you to all the participants, to Jillian for helping us out, and for being there. So,
yes,
Jillian,
right,
if you want to have the last word.
Okay. Well, with that, yes. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your thoughts. So once again, just a reminder to our participants who are going to be in the Zoom meeting with us. The Zoom link is still the same. We'll be meeting again at 8 a.m. tomorrow, Manila time. For those who are following us on YouTube, we will be providing another live stream link tomorrow. I'll post it on our Facebook account as well as our Twitter if you follow that. Our keynote speaker for tomorrow will be Father Rene Haveliana. So yes, there will be a lot of things to look forward to, including a second roundtable discussion, as Dr. Celis has mentioned earlier. Okay, so again, with that, thank you so much for today's discussion, and I do hope that we can put these ideas and words into action as well. Okay, great. So thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.